Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum Speaker Webinar Series and Podcast. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Dr. Mitchell Bard, Executive Director of the American Israeli Cooperative Enterprise and Director of the Jewish Virtual Library, join us to discuss Presidents and Prime Ministers Push Boundaries. Dr. Bard will speak for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Dr. Mitchell Bard.
Thank you very much. I hope there's a big crowd here for this event. We're going to try to cover the entire history of U.S. Israel relations in 15 minutes on one foot. We often categorize our U.S. presidents are more or less pro-Israel. And as I'm going to show, every president has policies which have been supportive of Israel in some instances and critical in others. They are not always trying to influence the election one way or the other, but they are pursuing what they see as the national interest, which may, in some instances, have some implications for the elections in Israel. And similarly, although I'm not going to go through all Israeli policies, Israeli leaders will be pursuing their own best interests, and that sometimes conflicts with America's and can have a fairly minor impact on our elections, but they can at least express their dissatisfaction when they have that. I'm going to try to run this PowerPoint, and okay, here we go. So one of the first things to keep in mind is that in the background of every U.S. administration are the Arabists who are in the State Department, they're in the Defense Department, they're in the intelligence community, and they have more or less influence depending on a particular administration and how closely their views coincide with those of the president. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but basically the Arabists have a belief that it's better for us not to have too close a relationship with the United States. That will affect our relationship with the Arab states. It'll affect our our supplies of oil, and that we need to be generally more even-handed, and that the United States really knows what's best for Israel. If you go back to the very beginning in the Truman administration, without Truman, who knows if there would be a state of Israel today. He supported the partition resolution. He immediately recognized Israel after it declared independence. But on the other hand, he had a couple of things which could have very seriously hindered and did hinder the establishment of the state and the victory in the 48 war, which was that the administration opposed having an international force to enforce the partition, and he imposed an arms embargo, which was largely the result of Arabist influence. If you skip up to Eisenhower, who's often seen as one of the most anti-Israel presidents in history, he actually was one of the first to recognize, was the first actually to recognize Israel as a strategic asset. He did it very belatedly after seeing that trying to rely on the Arab states was not going to be helpful to the United States. They were unreliable. He also encouraged our allies to provide arms. But he also was the first to really use a variety of threats, including cutting off aid, to force Israel to withdraw from the territories it captured in the Suez War. And by doing it without forcing the Egyptians to make any concessions, he sowed the seeds of the '67 war. Kennedy wasn't in office for very long, but one of the most important things he did off the bat was to agree to sell the first major weapon system to Israel, which were Hawk anti-missile defense systems, which he gave only because the Soviets had given the Egyptians bombers. On the other hand, he pursued this even-handed policy between Israel and the Arab states, and he was particularly concerned with Israel's nuclear program. We go quickly to LBJ. He sold more advanced weapons to Israel, and by selling Phantom jets in 1968, he set up what has been one of the critical aspects of U.S. Israel relations ever since, which is the policy of maintaining Israel's qualitative military edge over its Arab enemies. On the other hand, he was balancing the arms sales up until that point between Arab states that were allies of the United States and Israel. And he, of course, didn't help Israel when it came to the 67 war. Fortunately, from Israel's perspective, of course, it didn't need the United States' help in the end. Nixon, he did intervene in the 73 war by the airlift that helped Israel turn the tide in the fighting. He sent Kissinger to mediate the peace talks with the Egyptians, but he also let his Secretary of State at the time in 68 put forward a peace plan, which the Israelis saw as basically appeasing the Arabs. And he was more concerned with the impact of U.S. Middle East policy on détente than he was with pursuing relations with Israel. Ford wasn't in office for very long. He also had Kissinger negotiating the peace, first the disengagement agreements with Egypt that ultimately led to the peace treaty. But when Israel was uncooperative, he threatened a reassessment of U.S.-Israel relations, and this might have had more of an impact on Israel, if not for the fact that the members of Congress, a majority of members of the Senate, came out against the reassessment. And became clear to the Israelis that the threat really wasn't as severe as Ford had made it out to be. Jimmy Carter was someone with a mixed record. He was the one who got the anti-boycott bill passed after the Arab League boycott had been in effect since 1945. And of course, he was the mediator at Camp David. From the perspective of the Israeli government, a lot of pro-Israel folks, the fact that he saw Palestinians like U.S. blacks and was constantly speaking out against what he saw as Israel's persecution of Palestinians was problematic. He wanted an international conference to bring about a comprehensive peace, which was such a bad idea that it actually drove Anwar Sadat to go to Jerusalem to make peace on his own. He was obsessed with settlements, and he had, he sold F-15 fighter planes to Egypt and Saudi Arabia, which had severely upset the Israelis, and he wanted to get the PLO more involved in negotiations, which up until that point, Israel had vigorously opposed, and he was supportive of a Palestinian state. There was really no love lost between Begin and Carter. They both hoped to see the other removed from power. And in the case of Carter, he was the one who lost out in the end. When Reagan came to office, he was someone who maybe for the first time was pro-Israel because it was in his kishkas. He had a emotional attachment to Israel that most of his predecessors didn't have. He did a number of positive things you can see there in terms of aid, and especially in establishing the strategic cooperation relationship with Israel. On the other hand, people forget that there were a lot of negatives during the Reagan administration. He supported anti-Israel UN resolutions in a number of instances. He put forward a peace plan, which the Israelis objected to. He also didn't get along with Begin and rebuked him for bombing the Iraqi reactor. In response, he suspended F-16 deliveries. He also suspended strategic cooperation to punish Israel for annexing the Golan Heights. And then you had the massive lobbying battle of Reagan versus Begin over AWACS to the Saudis. And ultimately, it was Reagan who forced Israel to withdraw from Lebanon after the first Lebanon war. None of that really had as much impact on the future of either president. Begin, his future really was decided by his own policies toward Lebanon rather than anything that Reagan had done. When George H.W. Bush comes to office, a lot of people expected or hoped that he would embrace Reagan's policies. He really didn't. The positives were that he was in favor of loan guarantees. He helped rescue Ethiopian Jews. He tried also the international conference route, which some people see as positive, others negative, the Madrid conference. But on the other hand, he was probably maybe the first president to really dramatically impact the election in Israel. And that was when he tied the loan guarantees, $10 billion in loan guarantees, to the settlements. And because Yitzhak Shamir, as prime minister, was very much against any kind of linkage between the two, they butted heads. AIPAC was lobbying vigorously for the loan guarantees, and Bush came out one day saying he was this one lonely guy against these hordes of pro-Israel lobbyists, basically. And this ultimately soured relations between the U.S. and Israel, and it helped bring about the election of Yitzhak Rabin, who was more willing to go along with the loan guarantee linkage. You could see that James Baker wasn't very sympathetic to Israel, and was also, in many people's view, harmful to Israel that Bush insisted that Israel stay out of the Gulf War, even though ultimately the Gulf War benefited Israel by removing Saddam Hussein from the equation. Bill Clinton, sometimes seen also as one of the most pro-Israel presidents, because he rarely criticized Israel publicly. Whatever criticism he had typically was done behind the scenes. He helped secure the Jordan Peace Treaty, although it was really just signed on his watch. It was mostly negotiated without him. Similarly, the case for the Oslo Accords. You know, depending on your point of view, it may have been a pro or a con. The fact that the administration supported Oslo, they negotiated, arranged the Wye River plantation agreement, tried to solve the conflict in one fell swoop at Camp David in 2000. And he also probably was one of the few presidents that really tried to impact the Israeli election. He had a close relationship with his friend Yitzhak Rabin and wanted Shimon Peres to win the election against Netanyahu because he expected Peres to follow Rabin's policies, which Clinton approved of. And so he, at least in ways that were not a secret, supported Peres, but in the end didn't make a difference, and Netanyahu still won the election. George W. Bush, a lot of people were suspicious of him, thinking that he would have the policies of his father toward Israel. Instead, he was much more sympathetic. He sent the letter to Sharon, which really was significant because it said for the first time the United States recognized that changes in the situation on the ground meant that you couldn't force Israel to go back to the 1967 frontiers. He put more pressure on the Palestinians and, of course, launched the war on terror, which was to Israel's advantage as well. Like most presidents, he had his own peace plan, which went nowhere, the roadmap, and really didn't have much impact in the end. We skip up to Barack Obama, much more controversial, as everybody knows. A lot of people write him off as very anti-Israel, but he did a number of very positive things, as you can see, in particular, negotiating the 10-year military aid package, providing Israel its first F-35 planes, engaged in the first covert operations against the Iranian nuclear program. But there was a long list of negative things that people see about Obama from the very beginning, with his first foreign policy speech in Cairo, his focus on Muslims, skipping the trip to Israel, the settlement freeze that he insisted come without any Palestinian concessions, the signing of the nuclear deal, and the mutual antipathy that he and Netanyahu clearly had for each other. Netanyahu, this probably being the most dramatic instance of an Israeli prime minister trying to influence an American administration and election, was invited to Congress, gave a speech to the joint session. He was seen as being too friendly to the Republicans, upsetting a lot of Democrats, which have reverberations today. And again, it was an open secret that the two leaders despised each other and hoped that the other would be removed from office. Donald Trump, many people see as one of the most pro-Israel presidents because of leaving the Iran deal, negotiating the Abraham Accords, recognizing Jerusalem, clearly being much more sympathetic to Israel than the Palestinians, reflected by his cutting off the aid to the Palestinians. And it was an open secret as well that Netanyahu was supportive of Trump and saw him as having more similar interests to Israel, certainly, than Obama. On the other hand, Trump did a number of things that were not helpful to Israel. The peace plan, the fact that it was going to recognize a Palestinian state, was opposed by a lot of Israelis. The maximum pressure on Iran failed, which has led Iran to get closer to a nuclear weapon than it was before. And that certainly is the most important thing to Israel for security reasons. And he did a number of other things that were not helpful to Israel. And in the end, when Netanyahu congratulated President Biden on his election, President Trump was not very happy, saw it as disloyalty, and who knows if that will have any implications if there's a second Trump administration. And finally, if we look at Biden, a mixed record as well. He had a long record of support for Israel and a long relationship with the prime minister. He gave a record aid package to Israel. He supports the Abraham Accords. Maybe one of the most important things is the fact that he hasn't pushed a peace plan, because every one of his predecessors has had a peace plan that failed and usually involved pressuring Israel at the expense of concessions from the Palestinians. You can find a long litany of things that you can complain about if you're Israel or a supporter of Israel for some of his positions, in particular adopting a more even-handed approach consistent with the Arabist view, seeking a new deal with Iran, restoring relations and aid to the Palestinians, and being much more willing to criticize the president, not so much, but the State Department criticizing Israel when it takes positions that the administration disagrees with. And probably the most recent thing that upset a lot of Israelis, but many Israelis also support, was his coming out publicly, essentially supporting the demonstrators against the government in terms of believing that the judicial reforms that the government is proposing are, in his view, anti-democratic. That has upset a lot of people who think the United States should stay out of the internal affairs of Israel. And whether that has any implications for the future of who will be Israel's prime minister is yet to be seen. For the moment, of course, Netanyahu seems to be in pretty good shape, but Biden clearly preferred the prior government. And should things change in Israel, it's very likely that this administration will put its thumb on the scale in favor of an alternative to Netanyahu. That's a quick reading of the entire history of U.S. Israel relations. Let me stop there and let you give me your 2 cents worth of criticism.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. There we go. All right. So we have a few questions coming in. International lawyer Angie Rosemarine asks, would Israel-U.S. relations be better today with or without Mr. Netanyahu as Israel's prime minister? I know you just touched on that, but can you expand?
Well, it's not for me to say who should be the Israeli prime minister. I think that's going to be up to the people of the state of Israel. I remember, for years when I would give lectures, people would tell me, why don't you talk to the Israeli prime minister? Why don't you tell him to do this or that? It's, in my view anyway, not the business of Americans to tell Israelis what to do.
Absolutely. So Larry Greenberg asks, can Israel afford to give up U.S. military aid, which is almost all spent in the U.S.? Is it true that being freed from the restrictions associated with this aid would allow Israel to profit economically and politically?
It's a good question, and many people have suggested that Israel give up the aid so that it wouldn't feel as dependent on the United States. I don't think it's a realistic option for Israel. It needs the most sophisticated weapons it can get. Those come from the United States, and because of the aid that the United States provides that helps them afford those arms, which it otherwise wouldn't be able to do. And even if it wasn't dependent on arms from the United States, it still heavily depends on the United States for its trade and for its political support at the UN and everywhere else.
Thank you so much. An anonymous attendee asks, hasn't the Biden Middle East policies weakened the U.S. in the Middle East, especially with regard to dropping the ball on Syria and even more so Saudi Arabia and the Emirates?
Well, I would argue that the U.S. position in the Middle East was weakened first by President Trump by withdrawing troops, by failing to respond to Iranian aggression. I think those were problematic. His desire to also negotiate with the Iranians. But I think Biden has also fallen down by not responding also to Iranian aggression with various attacks against U.S. bases, by not being more sympathetic to the Saudis making the Khashoggi murder the be-all and end-all of the policy, which has severely damaged the relationship with the Saudis. It's hurt our economy because the Saudis don't want to cooperate on oil policy. And it's made it much more difficult to get the Saudis to move toward normalization with Israel. So I think there are certainly things that the administration needs to do to shore up its position in the Middle East.
Absolutely. And, there are rising tensions in the Middle East right now with Iran. So what do you think that the U.S. policies will look like going forward with the ties to Israel, should something come of that?
You're talking about specifically Iran. Well, I've been of the view for a long time now, and I guess I'm an outlier, as I believe the only way you stop the Iranian nuclear program is militarily. And the United States really wants to avoid that at all costs. It wasn't done when Trump was in power, certainly was opposed by Obama, and the Biden administration doesn't want to do it. They've had a number of joint military exercises with Israel that I think were meant to send a message to the Iranians that there could be a joint operation, but I don't think the Iranians really believe the United States is willing to go to war, even if it means stopping their nuclear weapons program. So I think Israel's going to have to go it alone. And as they did with bombing the Iraqi and Syrian reactors, have to take their chances on what the global reaction will be and what the U.S. reaction will be, but it will definitely be negative.
Absolutely. And on that point, Jack Berkowitz asks, from my recollection, following the Israeli bombing of the Iraqi reactor, while President Reagan and the State Department publicly scolded Israel, behind the scenes they were elated. Is that true?
Well, I think the elation came later. The ambassador to Israel, Samuel Lewis, had warned the Reagan administration, much as the Netanyahu Netanyahu government's been warning the last 3 presidents that if the United States didn't act, Israel would have to do it. So it shouldn't have been a surprise to the Reagan administration. I think they were very angry at the beginning, and it was only later, especially under the Bush administration, that they began to appreciate that helped save them from potentially facing a nuclear Iraq in the Gulf War.
Understood. David Levine asks, would you agree that one lesson from your talk is that no matter how much a U.S. president appreciates Israel and his kishkis, not one would risk his presidency to help Israel if he thought it would endanger his own power?
Well, I think that's true for any politician. They don't want to risk their own power, and they're certainly not going to risk it, I think, over something related to Israel. But they also recognize there are political implications. I mean, one of the reasons for selling arms to the Saudis is that those weapons are built by lots and lots of contractors and subcontractors who are voters, and it helps our economy. On the other hand, they also recognize that the Jewish vote, the pro-Israel vote, not just Jews, but pro-Israel voters, can make a difference in some states with a lot of electoral votes. They can make a difference in terms of the contributions to candidates, and that's an incentive for them to be certainly more pro-Israel. But if it comes to the difference between Israel and their own election, I don't think anybody should be surprised that they would choose their own election. The same with the Israelis. The Israeli prime ministers aren't going to risk losing power simply to satisfy the United States.
Very true. An anonymous attendee asks, could you care to comment on the impact of organizations like J Street and the liberal leadership of American Jewry on the presidential relations with Israel?
I don't think that the liberal side of what they consider themselves pro-Israel has much influence. They had a small degree with Obama because they had some people who had close relations with Obama and his advisors. I don't think that's as true with Biden, that it's more balanced. And I think the problem with some of the groups, in particular J Street, is that they are not particularly pro-Israel, that they believe that they know what's best for Israel. They have very much an Arabist point of view, that they know what's best for Israel, not the people of Israel, and that they believe that the United States should force Israel to adopt J Street's policies or the policies of other people who are more to the left. And my belief, again, and I think I stated at the beginning, is that I believe Israel is democracy, its people should make its own decisions, and that Americans don't know better than they do what's good for the state of Israel.
That's a very good point. Jay asks, why does the State Department seem to be chronically anti-Semitic, anti-Zionist?
I don't think they're anti-Semitic. There was a time when there were a number of anti-Semites in key positions in the State Department. I think over the years, most of that has been weeded out, but there are there's some legitimate reasons for being more pro-Arab. One is, if you want to serve in the U.S. State Department, what language would you study? Would you study Hebrew, where you can be the ambassador in exactly one country, or would you study Arabic, where you can be the ambassador in more than 20 countries? And those most State Department officials spend a lot of their time in the Arab world, and many of them get clientitis. That is, they tend to adopt the policies of the Arab states where they're representative. And they also, I think, have some, honest disagreements over whether relations with Israel hurt or enhance our relations with the Arabs. I think it's pretty clear empirically, if you look at the record, that U.S. Israel relationships, as they've gotten closer and closer, so have U.S. Arab relations, and the Arabists have always said it should be the opposite. And it's been proven over time that U.S. relations with the Arab world haven't suffered because of relations being better with Israel.
Absolutely. And you gave us a fantastic overview of the pros and cons of presidents going back generations there. Can you just sum up real quick what you think the best policies are going forward and what we should take and what we should leave behind?
Well, that's a big question. I think that, again, going to my basic philosophy is that the state of Israel is a democracy. It's a healthy democracy. We're seeing it from the protests that are going on, just how healthy it is. You see the free press and how healthy that is. They don't need American Jews, pro-Israel people in America, the U.S. government, or any other government telling them how they should run their government and what is in their best interests. If we want to make a difference, we can all move to Israel and have the right to vote there. But I think, the United States has its own interests. They don't always align with those of Israel. And we have to pursue our interests. And sometimes that will lead to divisions and disagreements. And that's not bad. We have those with every other government in the world. It just tends to get more attention in Israel with Israel because it gets flashed on the front pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post.
Absolutely. Great point to end on. Before we go, though, can you please tell our viewers where we can find some more of your work?
Well, the best thing is to go to our website, the Jewish Virtual Library, jewishvirtuallibrary.org. We've got more than 80,000 pages on everything from anti-Semitism to Zionism. And you can sign up for a weekly newsletter that has lots of information. And you can look for our new edition of Myths and Facts, a guide to the Arab-Israeli conflict, which was just updated and also just translated into Arabic.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Well, we've come to the close of our webinar. Thank you again, Dr. Bard, for joining us today.
Thank you.
For our viewers, please join us Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern for an update with Ashley Perry. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.